Speaker for this evening. It's Lucy Kemp, who will be talking to us about these amazing large hornbills, the Southern Ground Hornbills. Two species of ground hornbills that occur in Africa. There's the northern and the southern. And Lucy has essentially spent a lifetime in association with ground hornbills. So, Lucy, I'd like to hand over to you.
And then we aim away.
Brilliant,
hi, evening
thanks.
everyone. Yeah, my name's Lucy. I somehow have ended up neck deep in ground hornbills. It's an incredible species. So I'm just going to run through a little bit about the issues that the species faces, but also how critically important citizen science is for us to keep a handle on these birds. And like Kevin said, it's not me. It's a huge variety of people. They're a difficult, complex, long-lived species. And so this is the greater ground hornbill community. And we have a really cool collaborative nature. Everyone, it's going to take a community to bring the species back from the brink. So whether we're looking at the in-situ organizations where the birds have space in the wild, through to all the captive breeding, captive holding, hand rearing, artificial rearing facilities. And then the more we learn about ground hornbills, the more we find out how little we know about them. And so the more research that is required. And so we have a huge number of academic partners as well. They're a tricky species, and I'll get into that a bit. But yeah, it is going to take a community of South Africans to bring the species back. So as Rick said, we've got the Southern Ground Hornbill on the left, with the fully red. And then on the right, the northern or Abyssinian ground hornbill. Ours are distributed from southern Kenya all the way through to the Eastern Cape. And unfortunately, ours are now listed as endangered. And we've just managed to get the northern ground hornbill listed as vulnerable, basically based on the same threat categories that the southern ground hornbill faces. And we're in the process of setting up a northern ground hornbill working group. So give us a year or two, and hopefully we will have a suite of researchers across North Africa starting to try and tackle the issues that the other one faces. But the southern, that's the focus for my presentation tonight. They're a top order predator with all of the life history traits and extinction risks that come with that. They're incredibly culturally important. So wherever you are in the range of the southern ground hornbill, they're known as the rainbird, the thunderbird, and people have shared landscapes with these birds for millennia, and they're a very important part of people's everyday lives. And then because they have such a huge spatial requirement, in our sort of territory, our sort of habitats here in South Africa, we're looking at about 100 square kilometers per family group. And so anything we can fix within those 100 square Ks for ground hornbills, whether it's lead poisoning or any number of other things, that's great for a bunch of other savanna and grassland species, secretary birds, wild dogs, so they're a good umbrella and flagship species, and using that, I think, is going to help us get further with this. They're in a pretty bad place. So we're looking at a contraction of over 50% of the range. And that scale of decline is 15 to 20% in just the last half generation of the species. So although they're listed as endangered now, we are still, unfortunately, sliding to critically endangered. So our focus of the project is simply to slow the decline and then with time try and rebuild populations. But really at the moment, all we're trying to do is put the brakes on. And from that map, you can just see where the core habitats were. So that, can you see my, can you see my mouse and if not, how do I make it? Pointer options, laser pointer. Can you see my red dot? Yes, okay. So this is pretty much what the historic range looked like, but really the core population's a Kruger National Park. The Limpopo River Valley population is recovering slowly. That was almost extinct in the 80s. But what we're seeing now is this core population in southern KZN, and essentially this population only exists because of the cultural protection that the species is granted in these areas. So essentially, if you're a ground hornbill born in South Africa, you want to be born here or you want to be born in in Kruger. And this is an area which may or may not be a core, and this comes back to reporting rates. And so we don't know if this is just because we spend a lot of time in these areas and we have good data, or if it is in fact a true alternative core population. And so let me just get that out of the way. So, you know, and certainly within the Ground Hornbill group, for the long time we had this clear vision of ground hornbills in a Kruger kind of environment, in the low veld, in amongst elephant and rhino. But actually this is a true picture of ground hornbill habitat throughout the African range. They are comfortable and do very well in between homesteads, in between cattle, and this is their normal. And you know, obviously the normal used to be the big savannas and grasslands, but those are no longer, and so this is normal for southern ground hornbills. And the reason for the declines, unfortunately, are us. So there's a number of reasons. By far the biggest reason is these two here. Ground hornbills they will scavenge, and so as a group of ground hornbills walks through the veld, if they find a poisoned bait item, it's very likely that not just one ground hornbill but the entire group will feed off that poison bait, and so we don't just lose individuals from the population, we lose entire breeding units, and this is probably the primary cause for where the population is at the moment. But this lead toxicosis was something that we only really figured out was a problem for the species a couple of years ago because we monitor the reintroduced birds so carefully. But increasingly, we're finding that this may have a much bigger impact on the population than we've ever thought. So any lead ammunition, hunter shoots an animal, that lead bullet goes into the animal, it fragments into tiny little pieces within the carcass. And so even if hunters are very careful and cut off the entry site, you know, those tiny fragments of lead can travel up to 40, 50 centimeters through a carcass. And so if any offal or meat is discarded in the veld after a hunt, and ground hornbills or vultures or any other scavengers come along, they will ingest that lead. And we're finding now with ground hornbills, you know, normally things like vultures only show signs of getting sick from lead toxicosis at around 30 parts per million in the blood. But we're finding ground hornbills are really, really on death's door at figures as low as 7 or 11. And what we're finding is that the lead is causing gut stasis. And so then the birds are then getting secondary infections because the guts aren't working. And so they get sick a lot quicker and a lot faster than some of the other species. So really, you know, we flagged it as a problem a couple of years ago, but the more we learn, the more worried we are about this. We reintroduced a group at the start of this year into an area that was a big game farm. The birds, being birds, chose not to stay in the area that we chose for them, and they moved onto game farms where they do a lot of biltong hunting. And within 6 months, all 3 birds had come up with high levels of lead toxicosis. You know, so lead is in the environment, and it's a big issue for these birds. Loss of nests, they need big hollows in trees or on cliffs. We're losing a lot of those big trees in the landscape. Ground hornbills like to roost on big open structures, so things like transformers are an issue for them. They do become electrocuted. And then persecution. Ground hornbills are highly territorial, so as soon as they see their reflection in a shiny surface, to them that's an enemy coming to steal their wife, steal their nest, steal their territory. And so they retaliate, and that leads to a lot of human-wildlife conflict. And so we can do a lot of things about a lot of these things. So in terms of the persecution, we use this contravision on windows in rural areas, and you know, all we need to do is cut the reflection. This still lets light into the classroom, but stops the reflection, and we're finding this a very successful mitigation. Artificial nests, ground hornbills will take to artificial nests, and these we're building to be future proof. You know, we're finding that, you know, these long hot spells, heat waves like we're in now, we're finding that we are losing embryos to these long hot spells, and so we're trying to make these nests even more insulated than the current wild nests, so that looking forward, we're trying to mitigate for some of the climate change effects. And then harvesting, you know, the second hatch chick that would normally die, and artificially rearing these to try and form these wild roaming groups, so we can start plugging gaps within the distribution where we need to really fill in gene flow. And so if you look at a map of South Africa for ground hornbills, the sort of bluey grey blocks are where ground hornbills used to occur, and the red blocks is all we've got left. And so you can see there's been a massive decline in the population, but it's really hard to find these birds, to find a group within 100 square kilometers, even atlases going into the same pentad 10, 15 times aren't necessarily going to pick up the resident group there. And so we've had to look at some alternate ways of trying to monitor species. And so it's much like they do for the rhino in KZN. We've got a color-coded system. So you've got Pentad X on the landscape, and if a group is seen, and a Pentad is about a proxy for one territory size, give or take, so if a group is seen just once within a year, they're resident, they're permanent on their territories, so that block goes green. And if you have a look here, you can kind of skip a year or two, but if we're not seeing a group 3 years in a row, that raises a red flag for us, and we need to try and understand what's going on there, and if necessary, put in conservation mitigation measures. And so we think of the Pentads as green Pentads. We classify them within our team as free Pentads, which are ones where we find ground hornbills but they've never been reported, because for us, obviously, that's low income. We don't need to find a lot of funding to do that. Whereas if we're trying to reintroduce ground hornbills back into one of these Pentads, that's a very expensive and time-consuming process. And so starting from this year, we've started one of these 4-year cycles. We've started the National Monitoring Plan. And Jared, who's on my team as our research coordinator, every month he produces these maps. And the red dots, not consistent with our previous coloring, but red dots are Pentads for ground hornbills, where we have vetted the information, usually have photographs, where ground hornbills have not been reported in the last 15 to 20 years. And we're finding that we just need to get to more South Africans. There's a very strong citizen science core within certainly the birding community within South Africa, but we're now hitting up Joe Blog Farmer communities, principals of schools, and we have these WhatsApp groups throughout the country. And just this year, we've managed to find 100 Pentads where we have never had ground hornbills reported in the last 15 to 20 years. So, that's good news for ground hornbills, assuming all the current green Pentads remain green, that we're not losing groups to any of the previous threats that are managed. And so we call these citizen scientist groups champions. And these are some of the groups. And, we just keep record of who puts forward what, but we're up to nearly 3,000 new sightings this year, and that has led us to 100 new Pentads, and so that's good. And if we can just keep this running and keep interest and recruit more and more South Africans to this, we'll have a much better picture of what's happening for Southern Ground Hornbills, so that we can keep them playing like the silly farts that they are. Thank you for your time.
Lucy, thanks very much. Very interesting presentation about an extremely charismatic bird, obviously under threat. Do we have any questions for Lucy? I think Itaso has just mentioned in the chat box that please, if there are questions, do add them, and she'll make sure that the presenters receive those questions and they can then respond personally. So I think that's a very, very good idea. But I think very good effort, Lucy, to you and your team. And yeah, great to see the the role of citizen scientists there in increasing the number of sightings and number of Pentads where these where this species is found to occur. So long may that continue, and may that group grow as well.
Yeah, so just to ask if anyone has farming friends or people who wouldn't normally get stuck into this thing but have a particular love for ground hornbills, please get in touch and we can set them up with one of the champion groups.
Fantastic. Yeah, a question from Julio. Has any headway been made on reducing the use of lead in ammunition in the hunting community? I know that this is something that that is receiving attention in conservation circles.
Yeah, so about a year and a half ago, what is now DEF set up we started calling ourselves the Poison Working Group, a Wildlife Poisoning Working Group, but we realized that doesn't sound right, so it's the National Wildlife Poisoning Prevention Working Group. But within that, we have a lead task team, and we've managed to get community, the hunting community is part of that group. Now the fishing community, because there's a lot of lead and things like crocodiles in St. Lucia. And we've got the ammunition manufacturers on board, Department of Health, because obviously there's human health risks, and we are making headway, but I think it's because we have this high-level national strategy. So, you know, we bring our ground hornbill data, the vultures people bring theirs, and slowly we're going to be able to drive policy change, but unfortunately that's one sick ground hornbill at a time.
Great, thanks very much. Megan has just posted the question that I think many of us would be interested to have an answer to is there anything we can do to help the Mabula Ground Hornbill Project?
For us, other than actual gold, gold is any sighting records outside of Kruger. So, you know, we've got a good handle on Kruger, and this November we're spending a month in Kruger and we're putting up sighting posters and things. But really for us, any sighting records from the Eastern Cape in particular, which is really underrepresented, especially now that we're starting to have to do specialist studies on wind farm sites and things like that, we really need that information, you know. So yeah, if you know anyone down in those parts who'd be keen, Megan, we do get records from BirdLasser, but only now under the new Poppy Act, only if people sign up to us as the cause for their ground hornbill data, because BirdLasser can no longer share that data with us under the new Poppy Act unless the people signing up for BirdLasser have ticked us as their cause.
Is there a place where we can go and see information about recent sightings of ringed birds, like in Kruger?
So the ringing project was done by EWT, and they stopped that in 2015. But you're welcome to send through to us, and we will forward that on and get the information and send it back, or send it straight to EWT. But yeah, you know, obviously, you know, that would be good. Also, about 30 years ago, my dad did tattooing of ground hornbills in Kruger, on the facial skin on the side. And so what we're asking people for, visitors to Kruger in particular, is to really have a good look at those birds when you see them, because we've had positive records, both now. Yeah, it was one of Albert Froneman's photos on an Africa Geographic article that just happened to come together with our article, and it was one of the original tattooed birds. That ground hornbill is now 30 years old, and he's still a helper male in his natal territory. And so for us to get, you know, for a bird that lives for 70 years, to get resightings of those old tattooed birds is incredible. And so yeah, any and all sightings are like gold. Yeah.
That's fantastic. I see Craig has just asked, okay, Megan has answered, giving the contact details. Lucy, thank you very much, and yeah, all the best to you and your team on this very, very important project, with many facets to it. We wish you every success.
Cool.
Thank you. We've come to just after 8:30. So we're at the end of our allotted time. Les, would you like to just wrap up any comments?
Yeah, I thought that those were three amazing presentations.
Absolutely.
Quite different, and but all, you know, the citizen science thread that runs through all of them. Very different forms of citizen science, and it's amazing to see what people are achieving in all sorts of different ways. So thank you, Son, thank you, Kevin, and thank you, Lucy. That was just amazing, and I'm looking forward to sharing the videos with some key people in the next few days. Thank you.
Wonderful. Our Chief Admin, Itaso from Cambridge. Anything to add?
Right. No, the way amazing presentations, very interesting. So I will share with you all the contact emails and the videos again, so you can rewatch and share it with people to spread the word, and ask any further questions if you have as well. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you once again, folks, for joining us this evening. As I always say, what a wonderful community, and it's great to belong to this group with people from all over, and wonderful to share, to share the stories that we all have. And yes, keep going, keep up with the biomapping, keep up with supporting research and science as a citizen science community. Yeah, I think that's definitely the way to go. So thank you all very much for being with us, and we look forward to welcoming you to our next event,